Hello, everyone, and welcome to Quantum Portals. Today we have returning author Vincent Ortegon. He has written three books on Edgar Cayce, and today we'll be talking about his book on Atlantis. Vincent, you wrote three books already, and the last time we spoke, we talked about astrology, and now we're talking about Atlantis. So, what led you to write this book on Edgar Cayce and Atlantis?
After writing two books on Casey, I felt there was more material to cover. I knew he talked about Atlantis, so I wanted to investigate his readings on it and write my own book on Atlantis and give my own viewpoint.
So I'm assuming that Edgar Cayce spoke a lot about Atlantis. What did he have to say about it?
He gave a ton of information on it, many readings. He gave around 1,600 past life readings for people, and about half of those people that he spoke to were said to have been incarnated in Atlantis. He specifically said that the ancient Atlanteans are being reincarnated in the modern world at a rapid rate, especially in America. So overall, he spoke a lot about it.
Wow, that's really interesting. So let's start from the very beginning. Does Edgar Cayce talk about the origins of the planet Earth and the human race?
He once gave the statement that the earth in the beginning was only the expression of God and not a place for the souls of men. Casey said that animals were here on earth long, long before human beings came here. The earth was originally the animal kingdom. In the beginning, the earth was just an expression of God's creativity, like a beautiful painting, right?
Mm.
God was the artist and the earth was his canvas. Humans were not here in the beginning. Casey says at certain periods in time, there was an influx of souls that came upon the earth. Souls were floating above the earth's atmosphere and they noticed the earth and the world caught their eye. Spirits noticed the beautiful landscapes and the trees and the waters and the mountains. So spirits, souls in the higher dimensions, they saw the earth and they became curious and they wanted to enter the earth. So souls originally existed in the fourth dimension, and they pushed themselves into the earth, into the third dimension to experience. They became known as thought forms, and a thought form was a spirit that forced itself into physical matter. The fourth dimension entities wanted to come into the third dimension and experience physical pleasure. And it was this physical pleasure and the carnal forces that became a stumbling stone to the first spiritual entities that inhabited the earth. So again, when souls were hovering above, they took note of the sea creatures and they were interested and they wanted to merge with those animals. You know, spirits noticed the horses of the field roaming, galloping in the fields, and they wanted to take part and become like those animals. Edgar said that these spirits partook in what he calls animal magnetism. So these spirits joined together with these animals to create their own physical forms to roam the earth. So all those mythical creatures that you hear about in ancient mythology, those things were real. There were these animal human hybrids all over the place. He talks about mermaids. He says there were mermaids. He says there were
Mm.
satyrs. You know, the satyr, like the half man, half goat, run
So
around
like
drinking wine and playing
centaurs.
the flute. The centaurs, right? There
Okay.
was the half man, half horse, and there were these massive beasts. So when these souls came into the earth and took on these forms of the animals, there was a big variance. So there were all these crazy creatures walking around, and these spirits became trapped in these hardened bodies. And over time, they lost sense of their spiritual origin.
Hmm.
So after this happened, Casey mentions a person by the name of Emilius, and he says that Emilius was the first son of God. After all these spirits became trapped in the earth, Emilius looked down from heaven and saw all this chaos that was happening. It was a mess. You know, he saw all these spirits running around trapped in these bodies. So Emilius decided to enter the earth to show these lost souls how to escape from their body, how to escape from the material world. So when Emilius entered the earth, he became the first Adam. And Adam's goal in the beginning was to rescue souls from the earth and teach them how to escape from the material world. So Adam came to Atlantis in the beginning to rescue souls.
Okay, so Atlantis was there in the beginning then. And it's weird because I've never heard of Emilius. I guess he's one of the archangels or How would you describe Emilius exactly?
Cayce said that Emilius was the first son of God. I like to refer to Emilius as God's right-hand man.
Okay.
So he said that this Emilius, and I've done research and I've looked elsewhere, and I really can't find any mention
Mm-hmm.
of Emilius outside of the
Mm-hmm.
Edgar Cayce readings.
Okay.
But Cayce says that this person named Emilius, whether he was a divine angel or whether he was a type of Christ, he noticed the spirits that were trapped in the earth, and he decided to take it upon himself to enter the earth and to show these lost souls how to escape from the material realm.
Mm-hmm.
So that's what Emilius did. And then when he entered the earth, he was known as Adam. He became the first Adam.
Okay. It's interesting that these souls that are at the fourth level would want to become third, like they'd want to come back to that because I always thought that um, if you're going up from different levels, like you're at the second, third, and then fourth, and all that. So it's interesting that the pull for carnal pleasures was that strong. I mean, it's very
Right.
interesting. I know that you have to often hear about stories about how ghosts or different types of entities get stuck at this level and are not able to escape. So that's very interesting that they wanted to come back. I can tell you, I wouldn't want to come back here,
No,
but
I don't
that's
think
just
so.
me, you know.
And that's kind of what happened again, because this was kind of the realm
Mhm.
of the animals. So these spirits, though, they saw the earth and they're like, "Wow, I want to check
Mhm.
this realm out. I want to see what this is all about. I want to
Okay.
do what these animals are doing." So these souls, where they were doing animal-like behaviors and engaging in animal-like things. However,
Hmm.
there were the souls who wanted to remain in the fourth dimension. So these souls who looked at the earth, and some of these souls said, "No, I don't think that's a good idea. I don't want to
Yeah,
go
that'd be
into the
them.
earth." Yeah, and a lot of these divine angels said, "No, I'm not going to do that." But a lot of those angels decided to go into the earth
Hmm.
and partake in the earth and all these carnal forces. So what happened was there was a separation of good spirits and bad spirits. So the spirits
Okay.
who remained in the fourth dimension and didn't engage in the earth, those spirits became known as the sons of God. And the evil spirits who wanted to enter the earth and do bad things, they became known as the sons of Belial.
Okay.
And these are like the evil groups, And if you look at ancient texts, there's
Hmm.
actually mention of this group, the sons of Belial. So there was a big
Hmm.
spiritual separation that took place when there
Hmm.
was the fall of angels.
Yeah, well, it also sounds, I mean, for those of us who took Sunday school, it sounds like there's a bit of a fallen angel aspect there as well, because one of
Right.
the things they say in the Bible is that they came unto the daughters, they found that the daughters of men were beautiful and they came unto them.
Exactly.
So they definitely came down. So the whole idea of fallen angels coming down and intermingling with the angels and then creating, I guess, not monstrosities, but basically the giants and different types of creatures
Yeah.
is interesting. So it sort of ties in with what the Bible is saying as well.
Right. Yeah, and Casey plays on that as well, and he mentions
Hmm.
that the angels looked upon the female forms and lusted after them. They liked what
Hmm.
they saw, they wanted to marry them.
Hmm.
And when these angels pursued the female figures, that's what brought feelings of contempt, that brought feelings of hatred and
Hmm.
jealousy and bloodshed. So
Hmm.
those fallen angels, that was kind of the beginning of the downfall.
In that case, how did Atlantis come about after all this going on with the spirits and the animals and all that? How did
Mhm.
Atlantis come on the scene?
Atlantis was originally one giant landmass. There were these physical entities and thought forms that were all over the earth. And Atlantis was home to many of these spirit entities. In Plato's story of Atlantis, you have the god Poseidon. So in the beginning, he says that all the gods were given dominion over certain land areas, and the land of Atlantis was bestowed upon Poseidon. And it was Poseidon who was able to construct Atlantis, and he made it into these circular rings and these zones. If you see these old maps of Atlantis, it looks like
Yeah,
these
they've got
rings. And
concentric rings. That's how Plato
right,
describes it. Yeah.
and that's how apparently that's what Plato says is
Mm.
that Poseidon designed it that way.
Okay.
So there were all these entities that lived all over the earth, but Atlantis was a central hub for all these entities. So the entities that populated Atlantis, they had to live there, so they had to build it up. They had to
Mhm.
create buildings, they had to create castles and houses, they had to build ships and all these transportation crafts. So
Hmm.
over the years, Atlantis became a highly advanced culture. The ancients possessed these psychic powers that they used. They could use their minds to construct their environment. Casey says that psychic science was the norm back then, not science like it is today. Science is
Okay.
different today than it was back then. He says
Hmm.
the occult sciences and the psychic science was normal back then. So with these occult and psychic sciences, this is where those fourth dimensional powers come into play. You could use your
Hmm.
mind to emanate these vibrations
Yeah.
to move objects.
Hmm.
So again, people back then they were able to use those creative forces of the fourth dimension, but as time went on, those creative forces started to disappear and people could no longer use their minds to move objects. Those abilities kind of fell by the wayside
Hmm.
as they became more trapped in the bodily forms.
Hmm. Yeah, it's interesting because there's a couple of things here that I'm picking up is that um, as much as we think that Poseidon and all those stories of that are, for some people it's just like, a lot of mythology and it's myth, but often these types of stories are based at some level on truth. Now, I don't know to what extent, but it's interesting that Edgar Cayce mentions Poseidon. So that's kind of interesting how there's an intermingling between what we consider myth and what Edgar Cayce is saying. But then at the same time, a lot of different scientists are saying that, especially people who are studying the ancient aliens and ancient type of um, mythologies, is that they're saying that we had these abilities, as you pointed out, and that we're on a path right now of rediscovering. So we've sort of gone full circle. We had the abilities and we sort of left it, went through the
Yeah,
sciences, like the hard sciences and all that,
right.
and we left a lot of the astrology and all these sort of the softer sciences and the psychic sciences
Yeah,
behind. And now we are coming back and we're rediscovering a lot of the old things that we thought were just myth. And now they're starting to become like,
right.
okay, wait, this is actually really happening. So a lot of people are becoming more interested in psychic abilities and using their psychic abilities, manifestation, and all that. And then now, I mean, this is a bit off the tangent, but a lot of people are saying that the pyramids were built with sound technology. So we are starting to rediscover that as well, that some of the larger
Yeah,
structures that were built in ancient world were built using sound. So that's
right.
also being rediscovered as well. So it's interesting how
Wow.
we're just sort of rediscovering our roots. We think that it's something new, but it's not. It was here before. But
Yeah.
yeah, so that's kind of interesting, and it means that Atlantis was really, in many ways, a very, very advanced culture. So, with everything that we're talking about in terms of rediscovering some of the old technologies, what that leads me to wonder what kind of technologies did the Atlanteans use then?
Casey says the technologies of the Atlanteans are something that modern man is unable to recreate, reinvent, or even reconsider. You
Hmm.
know, the technologies were so different, we can't imagine. We really can't think
Hmm.
about how they did it, but they were able to do it. But he
Hmm.
says a lot of the conveniences that we have today, they had in Atlantis. They had wireless capabilities. They had these power storage stations. They had planes. They
Hmm.
had levitating carriers. He says they had these gas-powered chariots for their convenience.
Hmm.
He also gave a reading once where he said they have these pleasure vehicles that hover close to the Earth's surface, whatever that is. He said they have these pleasure vehicles. I don't know if it's like some kind of cool space car or
Hmm.
a hovercraft, but I mean, if you think about it, we kind of have pleasure vehicles today, right? We have our Harley Davidsons and cool
Hmm.
cars, but he says they have these pleasure vehicles that they're able
Hmm.
to, fly around in.
Hmm.
He says they had ships of the air. He called them ships of the air, and these ships were able to sail under the water through the elements and then come above and sail through the air as well. And to make these ships, there were mechanics and engineers who had to design these ships. So they combined elements of brass, they used aluminum, they used uranium, and they made these frameworks for these carriers. He says that chemicals similar to asbestos were used.
Oh
He also,
boy.
yeah,
I hope not, because this vessel's not exactly the safest, but maybe, I don't know, maybe it was
right,
different back then.
yeah, he said a chemical similar to asbestos. So
Oh, okay,
I
maybe,
hope it wasn't
hopefully
real.
not.
Yeah,
God, oh,
because that's
you
no
know,
good. But he
that's
also,
that's no good.
yeah. He also said that to make these ships, they would use the skins of animals. He specifically
Oh
mentioned,
no. Oh.
he said they used the skins of elephants
Oh God, no.
to cover these crafts. But again, we do that today, right? The Indians to build their tents, to make tents and
Mm-hmm.
covers and
Yeah.
blankets, they would always leather. Look, we use leather today
Yeah,
to
I
wrap
know.
our seats.
Mm-hmm.
So they used the skins of animals, like specifically elephants, to create these crafts, and they proved to be very lightweight
Oh wow,
to
these
fly
poor
around the earth.
elephants. Oh
I
boy.
know, I
Yeah,
know.
I love
Um,
elephants. But yeah, so basically, I don't know. I have a different opinion in terms of like he's saying that, we cannot imagine these things. And I mean, you also have to remember that Edgar Cayce was giving these readings back at a time when we really didn't have as much technology. So I think
right.
that compared to, let's say, 2024 with the AI and all that kind of
True.
stuff, I think we can imagine it. I mean, that's just my own personal opinion.
Yeah.
But I mean, obviously, if you're 1920s or 30s, the technology was quite primitive back then. So I
Yeah.
mean, so I think we're on the way to really
Mhm.
coming back to that sort of point in time. One of the things that I find interesting, though, when they talk about Atlantis, in particular technology, they talk about the use of crystals. They talk about harnessing crystals. And while on the one hand, that seems kind of, mystical and all that kind of stuff. I mean, we already use a certain amount of crystals in like our computers and our watches, that sort of
Yeah.
thing. But I think what he's talking about is a different type of like much bigger, much more advanced use of crystals. Would you like to comment on that?
Yeah. The powers of crystals came to be recognized and utilized by all the Atlanteans. So they
Mhm.
had all these numerous power stations that they set up. Similar today, we have all these power plants that we set up. They had these power storage stations back in the day. And these power centers were the driving force for all the energies that were needed to power the trains and the ships and the aircrafts. So Casey talks about a building that housed this giant large ruby crystal,
Okay,
and
wow.
it had like a retractable roof. So they had this big power storage center with this giant ruby crystal, but the
Hmm.
roof would kind of go back and forth. It was retractable. So when they needed
Hmm.
more power, the roof would go back and more
Okay,
power was generated. And when they needed less power, the roof would close up again. So these crystals would capture the sun's rays
okay.
and it would generate this energy. And they would direct these rays of energy to the transportation crafts. It was like a beam. It was like this beam of
Wow.
energy. And interestingly enough, he talks about this death ray. He says the
Hmm.
word death ray. He says they
Hmm.
had this death ray that was very powerful and
Hmm.
it tore up the landscape. And that's what the Atlanteans did. They tore up their landscape,
Okay.
created bombs and explosions, and they destroyed their land.
Okay, wow, it's interesting because Nikola Tesla talks about the death ray. So I'm wondering if maybe he had a hint from that. That sounds pretty scary, but I mean the use of crystals is actually kind of interesting. And I mean you're talking about retracting roofs and these power stations. I'm wondering in some ways, I know there's a little bit of talk about this that I know with Christopher Dunn, who has done a lot of work, for example, with pyramids. He talks about how the pyramids were actually power stations
Yeah,
and that maybe some of the power was either used, I guess, on land or could have been sending power up, into the atmosphere. Who knows? Because we have pyramids all over the world. So I'm wondering if maybe some of these pyramids were actually used as power stations to power flying craft. But I mean that's interesting. But I guess it remains to be seen what that is.
right. Yeah, and the pyramids, I think they said that there was like a limestone, a capstone
Hmm.
on the pyramid at one point, or that the
Yeah.
pyramid had limestone covering or
Yeah,
something.
it
So
did. Yeah.
yeah,
Pyramids were covered in limestone. So, they were gleaming in the sun. That's what I remember
yeah,
reading about. So that's kind of interesting. In your book, you were mentioning about how the Atlanteans were, I guess Edgar Cayce talked about how the Atlanteans were being terrorized by beasts and monsters. Can you just give us a little bit more information about that? What's that about exactly?
like Edgar said in the beginning, there were these monstrosities upon the earth. They
Mhm.
might have been like dinosaurs, because we know dinosaurs existed, these huge creatures, or they might have been like these massive rhinoceros creatures, but there were these huge beasts in Atlantis, and they became a real problem for the nation. and the government officials would meet, whether it's once a month or the government would meet with each other, and they would discuss the animal problem and how to dispose of the animals. These monstrosities were endangering humans, and the Atlanteans were always at war with the animals. But, like in today's time, we don't have an animal problem like they
Mhm.
did. Today we have like zoos
Well,
where
it's
we
quite
can,
the reverse. They were the ones who were terrorizing the animals, for that matter, and their
pretty much.
environment too, you know?
Right. Today we have zoos. Today we could confine animals where we could go and pet
Hmm.
animals behind the glass. But in
Hmm.
back then, it was different. The animals were way larger, they were more volatile, and they
Hmm.
were harder to control. So people of Atlantis, they built bombs and explosives to take out these animals.
Wow,
Yeah, and
that
that, and
is
that's
crazy.
that's another way they demolish the environment. They use these huge bombs
Wow.
and to destroy the animals, and in the process, they destroyed their land, and portions of the land started to sink.
Hmm. It's weird because, and I mean, I guess it's just social media or Hollywood that gives us this idea that the Atlanteans were like genteel and soft and all that, and yet they sound like really just horrible. It sounds like something out of Lord of the Rings. It's almost
Yeah, right.
Sauron, tearing things up. But
Yeah, and
yeah,
as
those animals must have been something big. It's not like a lion, which you can just sort of like throw a spear. I mean, must have been like these big, big
they
monsters.
were huge. They were
Yeah.
big, crazy beasts. And
Hmm.
Casey mentioned, as I said before, they had some kind of death ray. And he talks about this death ray he said, in the 1960s, we're going to rediscover this death ray that they used in Atlantis. So maybe they discovered it, maybe they didn't. But he said that this death
Hmm.
ray that they used punctured the earth. It split into the earth
Hmm.
and it divided portions of the land, right? So they used these laser beams and which hurt the land.
Hmm.
And the crystals that they were using were also generating radiation. So these
Okay.
crystals became harmful as well. So a lot of damage was being done to the environment. There were a lot of upheavals that were happening in the landmass, and portions started to sink. So over thousands of years, he says there were three major catastrophes that happened to Atlantis.
Okay.
So over time, it became a really unstable environment, and people had to leave there.
Okay. Wow. That's pretty nuts. Well, I guess that we really it's weird you mentioned the death ray, and like I'd said before, I think Nikola Tesla talks about the death ray, and when he died, a lot of the American government, a lot of the Secret Service took a lot of his notes.
Yeah.
And I think that he was working on the death ray, but didn't want to really give it to the government because he said in the wrong hands, it could really do a
Oh,
lot of
wow.
damage. So
I didn't know that.
yeah, so a lot of people said that he already perfected the death ray and that it was that technology was in his notes and that was taken away by the government officials
Wow.
when he died. So, and you're saying that the death ray destroyed portions of the land. Does that mean that there was a lot of destruction? Did that by any chance cause the sinking? Lead to the sinking of Atlantis if the land was being destroyed, and what happened to the people as a result?
The land didn't sink overnight. In Plato's story, he said that the destruction happened over the course of a day,
Hmm.
where it didn't really happen like that. There were times when large portions would sink, like, when they blew up the land or when they
Hmm.
used the lasers or something. There were times when the land would sink suddenly.
Okay.
And there were times when large portions would waste away over the years. It took
Hmm.
many, many years, but eventually portions would waste away. So when the land started to disappear, the people had to board ships and sail out to other places where they could start new lives. So the
Hmm.
people of Atlantis, they got on their ships and they traveled to Egypt. Some of them went to the Yucatan territory and
Hmm.
some of them went to South America. So they went all over the place.
Yeah, that's interesting because we do hear about that, and especially in ancient Egypt. I know that when Plato was talking about Atlantis, he says that his ancient ancestor Solon was speaking with Egyptian priests and that they told him about Atlantis. And so they shared a lot of technology. So that definitely once again ties in with what Edgar Cayce is saying about Atlantis. But it's interesting because again, looking at what we're doing today with our land, we are also destroying it, but also because of the destruction that we're doing to the earth in terms of the environment, like with global warming, we're actually going to see things start sinking as well. Like, I mean, the
Yeah,
water levels are rising,
right.
and because there's so much water and so much flooding going on, you have a lot of soil erosion. You see what's happening these days, I think, in like parts of Germany or parts of Europe. It's just completely waterlogged. It's absolutely crazy. So
Yeah.
we haven't learned our lesson yet. So it's unfortunate. Can you tell us a little bit more about the people themselves, though? Their customs, what they looked like, their dress, maybe a little bit
Mhm.
more about the people themselves?
Yeah, in the beginning, Atlantis was a very peaceful and moral place.
Hmm.
Everyone loved one another, everyone worked in communion with one another. It was a very loving and peaceful environment. But as time went
Hmm.
on, the culture slowly became more corrupt. A lot of people became self-centered, and a lot of people started to stray away from the spiritual things and religion, and there were a
Hmm.
lot of evil groups that
Hmm.
were running around. And as I mentioned before, there were the sons of Belial, which were the evil
Hmm.
groups. He called them the sons of Beelzebub.
Hmm.
He also called them the sons of worthlessness,
Hmm.
or there were
Hmm.
a lot of these evil groups running around,
Hmm.
and they were the wicked ones in society.
Yeah.
Uh, so these bad groups were intent on committing evil and living for pleasure and
Hmm.
self-gratification. However,
Hmm.
there were a lot of good people in Atlantis still. There were good groups, and he called them the children of the law of one. These were the holy groups. They were very peaceful, loving, and they wanted to keep the spiritual truths intact. So again, in Atlantis, there was a mix of good and bad groups. There was good people and bad people.
But it's interesting because you mentioned a lot, different groups of bad people, and I know in the Bible, or definitely Jesus mentioned these scenes, mentioned the archons, who were a group of evil people that came from, I guess, for lack of a better term, outer space, and came into this planet and started to sow a lot of evil into this planet. So that's kind of interesting as well. So with every myth or any legend, you always have a certain amount of truth that's there, and you hear about the story in many different cultures how there are certain groups that came in from outside and basically corrupted the earth. So could that be also maybe linked to why there was a great flood, or to try and sort of clean up the planet? Who knows? But it's not the first time that I've heard that. But then also I find it interesting you mentioned the Sons of the Law of One, and I know that the Law of One was a book that was written in terms of the Law of One material, which was a set of channeling and readings that were done between 1981 and 1984. I know that those were channeled materials with Carla Ruckert, Don Elkins, and Jim McCarty. So it's interesting that, again, there's a sort of a cross pollination of confirmation that this material and this all this stuff really did happen. So I
Yeah,
just find that interesting that you mentioned the law of one, and that the law of one talks about all this type of information. So that's pretty interesting. I think what I'm finding very fascinating is that there's confirmation on either side. Never, where you review a book, you can find confirmation for what Edgar Cayce is saying. So that's
right.
pretty good. You had mentioned as we started talking today that Atlantis, when the continent of Atlantis went down and all these people died, a lot of these people that were in Atlantis are starting to reincarnate again today. Are they reincarnating everywhere, or where is the concentration of these new souls of Atlantean souls located?
Yeah, according to Casey, we are the Atlanteans.
Oh, okay,
So the doctors and the engineers and all the construction workers of today's society, they
okay.
did that kind of work back then. They had all those talents and they carried over those talents from back then. So he gave past life readings for people who were pilots. He gave a reading for a woman who was a pilot in the modern time, and
Hmm.
she was actually a pilot in Atlantis too.
Okay.
Yeah, she operated one of the ships. Like I said, there were a lot of mechanics, there were a lot of
Hmm.
electrical engineers, there were scientists and teachers. There was a man he gave a reading for. He worked on elevators. He was some kind of construction engineer and worked with elevators in a building. There were nurses, there were priests, and there were kings. So there were some people who worked at the power storage station with these large crystals. They were responsible for operating these huge firestones. He gave a lot of past life readings for people who were responsible for blowing up the land. And
Wow.
he would tell the individual the entity lost in this experience, for the entity was operating the Firestone and hurt the environment. It created a bomb. So he gave past life readings for a lot of people who actually brought damage to Atlantis.
Hmm. That's interesting because I know that I'd heard about a remote viewer by the name of Courtney Brown. He has a group of people that he works with, and he had them do like a remote view back into Atlantis. And a lot of times they talk about how people were controlling machines and that some of the destruction that was going on, people were running to and fro, and this destruction was happening. And a lot of people were actually, like you said, engineers that were unfortunately responsible for all that. So I think on the one hand, while myth and Hollywood have this sort of volcano or something happening to Atlantis, it might be just because of their own, they're up to their own devices that led to the sinking, like the explosion or the sinking of Atlantis. I find that kind of interesting.
Yeah, a lot of people, they
Mm-hmm.
had what I like to say technological ignorance. They had these
Mm-hmm.
real powerful machines, they had these powerful crystals, and these uh the crystals and their machines, they became too powerful for them.
Mm-hmm.
The bombs that they created, they became too powerful for them. And
Mm-hmm.
they hurt everybody. They hurt the land, they blew up their land. And again, same thing as today. We create the atomic bomb and we blow these things up and we're doing the
Mm-hmm.
same thing.
Yeah, it's very unfortunate. In your book, you talk about Lemuria. Can you tell us a little bit more about Lemuria? It's a lost continent or something, right?
Lemuria existed long before Atlantis. It's been
Okay.
said that Lemuria was the cradle of the human race. Lemuria is where it all began. This could
Mhm.
have happened anywhere from upwards of 30 to 50 million years ago, as some people claim.
Wow. That
Yeah.
far back. Okay.
When it comes to the Edgar Cayce material, he doesn't talk too much about Lemuria. He mentions it in only 20 text documents.
Okay.
He gave past life readings for people who were actually in Lemuria, though, at one
Hmm.
point. Um, Edgar said that Lemuria began its disappearance way before Atlantis.
Hmm.
Besides Edgar Cayce, there were other clairvoyants of the 20th century who talked about Lemuria. You have the British writer James Churchward. He wrote a prominent work on Lemuria called The Children of Mu. You have uh, the Russian psychic Helena Blavatsky. She wrote about the Lemurians, and she said that they were from the third root race. She describes them as these huge ape-like entities and that they communicated telepathically. Some of them had multiple arms and some of them had these giant eyes on the back of their head. You have another writer, William Scott Elliott. He talks about the Lemurians being like 12 to 15 feet tall. They were huge. He says they had
Wow.
this brownish skin and with these eyes that were far apart. He also talked about the Lemurians having this giant third eye. He says that they were these,
Really?
yeah, he also says they were like these
Like a
uh,
cyclops almost.
a cyclops or something like that. These weird, whether they're like an alien-like or reptilian type entity, I'm not exactly sure, but he
Hmm.
said they were asexual. They would reproduce by laying eggs, that kind of thing. So a
Oh
little
my God.
strange. Yeah, a little strange. But I mean, these are a few different psychics.
Wow.
These are their viewpoints on it.
Okay.
But one of one of the psychics who gave a lot of information on Lemuria was Rudolf Steiner.
Okay.
And like Edgar Cayce, he also received his information from the Akashic records.
Hmm.
And Steiner said that the Lemurians had these incredible psychic powers. They could also use their minds to move objects, right, and build up their landscape. He
Hmm.
said the Lemurians, at first, they didn't have a language, that they communicated telepathically. But as
Okay.
time went on, language eventually came about,
Hmm.
and they started to remodel their bodies as they function in the material world in the earth. They kind of started to change their form. So the as time went on, the modern man and female forms kind of started to form closer to that.
Okay. Hmm.
He says the Lemurians built schools where they would teach subjects on psychology and powers of the universal forces. He says that they had these colleges of willpower where they taught about psychic powers. So yeah, the Lemurians
Wow.
were also highly into the occult abilities and psychic powers.
Hmm.
In Lemuria, the landscape was very cataclysmal. There were earthquakes and
Hmm.
volcanoes happening everywhere. there were fires and there was lava all over the place. So,
Well, that makes sense, though, if you consider how far back, if they were like 20, 50 million years ago, that would have been also around a time when the Earth was still sort of, I mean, maybe not forming completely, but like, I mean, definitely wasn't the most ideal time. So, yeah, that does make sense to a
right.
certain
And,
degree.
and, and
Yeah.
just like Atlantis, Lemuria had the same problems.
Hmm.
Lemuria, at one point, it was no longer a suitable environment. And so that's when the Lemurians had to leave Lemuria, and the Lemurians actually went to Atlantis, where it was a safer place.
Okay, that's interesting. And another thing that I find interesting is that again, there's this talk about how way back when we had all those abilities, we had the abilities of speaking with our minds and moving objects with our minds, that sort of thing. And it's only as we get further and further into the modern day that we've lost a lot of that type of ability. But also, it's interesting how, and I mean, look, I have nothing against modern science. I mean, not at all. I mean, modern science has definitely brought us a lot of innovation, and especially in the health field. However, it's just interesting how we used to have a much more psychic approach and a much more holistic or maybe esoteric approach to the sciences. And I think that it's nice to have, you don't need to have one or the other. It'd be nice if we had a mixture of both. I think that would have been
Right,
nice.
right.
Something like alchemy, which could, definitely use both. But like I said, while science is very good, I think it's left behind a lot of its soul or
Yeah,
its spirit, as it were. And so I think that's science in many ways. But again, I think that a lot of people are starting to rediscover, even scientists themselves are starting to rediscover. I mean, I know that it's still taboo to sort of talk about anything having to do with psychic ability, but I think that scientists are becoming a little bit more open when they talk about how, the actual physical merits of meditation or different types of abilities that are definitely there. Now they're starting to talk about maybe there's something to the NDE, like the
yeah,
near-death experience, that sort of thing. So I think that science is slowly, maybe not as fast as let's say the average person, but maybe slowly but surely science is starting to come around and sort of say, yeah, maybe we shouldn't just close ourselves off to the psychic aspect of what it means to be human and maybe
right.
incorporate it. Why not?
Yeah, and as I said before, Casey said that the occult sciences, the psychic sciences, that was normal back then.
Hmm.
That was the norm. But
Yeah,
again, as we became obsessed with the physical body and the
exactly.
environment,
Hmm.
we lost touch with those spiritual
Hmm.
forces
Hmm.
that we have. And one thing Edgar says, a famous phrase by him, is that mind is the builder.
Okay.
And
Yeah.
he says that the mind, you could pursue anything you want. You could pursue mathematics, you could pursue engineering,
Hmm.
you could pursue whatever you want.
Hmm.
The mind becomes what it feeds upon. The mind can move in any direction. So the
Hmm.
mind, if you want to be involved in the occult forces and the occult sciences, your mind will move towards those things and you could
Hmm.
develop those abilities.
Hmm. Well, it's interesting because a lot of people are talking about how with the mind you can manifest, and so I sort of
Yeah,
maybe that's sort of how it's beginning to become. We're getting back to that because now you'll see, every second video on YouTube, they're talking about manifest this and use your mind to manifest that,
yeah,
whatever. And I mean, I do think it's very serious, but it's interesting how that's becoming very clear that we create our own reality. So
right,
if we create our own reality, then it's because it's the mind. Wherever we put our energy, we create. So
right.
that's kind of interesting in that sense. So you mentioned that there are changes that are going to be taking place in America and the rest of the world. Can you expand upon this?
Edgar gave many prophecies about the future of the earth and what's going to happen. He said there's going to be a lot of changes on the earth. Continents are going to break up. He said that there's going to be open waters in the northern portions of Greenland. He said there's going to be a falling away of India. He said
Really?
that, yeah, new
Okay.
lands are going to surface in the Caribbean Sea. So again, it's going to be a volatile environment. It already is.
Hmm. Hmm.
Hurricanes are happening, landslides, and he
Hmm.
said the coastal regions of the U.S. are vulnerable spots. So southern
Hmm.
portions of Georgia and South Carolina will disappear. He even claimed that New York will disappear.
Well, I can see that. I mean, I've heard things about, I mean, I don't know if it was like sort of like hearsay, but they said that the island of Manhattan was way too heavy
Wow.
and that was actually going to go down. But I definitely, if I had to sort of put money on it, I would say that more about the West Coast. I think the West Coast, they're saying that there's going to be, they're still waiting for the big earthquake. Like there was one in
Yeah.
1906, but I think that there's going to be a really big one, and that's going to just break things off. So California
Yeah, definitely.
and
Los
and
Angeles.
Los Angeles, parts of British Columbia, that sort of thing are going to go into the water, and that's just straight science right there. I think it's unfortunate, but I definitely see that. And I know that other psychics have also talked about different portions of the United States going underwater and everything. So I think the Great Lakes are going to expand, or that the Mississippi is also going to expand. So there's going to be a lot of flooding, which again doesn't surprise me considering a lot of the earth changes that are going on,
Right.
and in particular, a lot with the flooding as a result of global warming. So it's not that hard to imagine,
Right.
but it definitely is something that we have to pay attention to.
Right. Definitely.
Mhm.
Definitely possible. And again, it's going to be those outside coastal regions. So he said Los Angeles and San Francisco, those are going to be some of the first states
Yeah.
that get destroyed even before New York.
Hmm.
When all this happens and when these coastal regions start to go underwater, he said that there's going to be safety areas and safe zones where people could travel to when these catastrophes hit. So again,
Hmm.
when it happens to Florida and California, people could migrate to the center states. So the interstates are going to be the safe zones where people could find refuge.
Okay.
So some of those states are going to be like Illinois or Ohio, Indiana. So these are going to be the safe zones. He also mentions Virginia.
Okay.
Um, Says Virginia, specifically Virginia Beach,
Okay.
he said will be the safest, if not the safest land area to live on. And that's actually where his headquarters is located in
Yeah.
Virginia Beach.
Okay.
So
That's
yeah, that's
interesting.
pretty interesting, right?
It's smart because they talk about the Hall of Records in Egypt. And I remember we talked about that the last time we talked about your book, about Edgar Cayce's psychic astrology. And we mentioned how under the right paw of the Sphinx, there was a Hall of Records which kept all the information and all the knowledge. And I'm wondering if Edgar Cayce was thinking about that when he set up his his institute on in Virginia Beach, because to keep all those records safe from any kind of flooding. So that's remains to be seen. But
That's
I
a good
think that's
point.
pretty yeah, I think he would have thought about that. I think that would
Right,
have been yeah,
exactly. Yeah,
definitely.
he foresaw where the
Hmm.
safety zones are in Virginia Beach. It's a beautiful area, and there's a certain
Hmm.
energy there.
Hmm.
And he recommended that his institution be there. And again, he said that's going to be one of the safety zones, the safest place, one of the safest place in America.
Okay, well, that's pretty cool. Well, that is really interesting, Vincent. That's really cool. I know we can talk for hours on that, but we'll have to come back again and do another interview with that. But you mentioned that you're also working on another book with Edgar Cayce. You want to tell us a little bit more about it before we sign off?
Yeah, my new book yet to be released. I still have to finish it.
Hmm.
It will be based on all his medical readings.
Wow.
Yeah,
Okay.
I talk about the causes of disease and illness. I touch upon diet and nutrition. I talk about meditation, prayer, purification, a lot of remedies and hydrotherapy, electrotherapy, castor oil packs. So there's a lot of information to cover, so
Wow.
I'm excited to work on it,
Okay,
and
that is exciting. Oh my
I think
God.
it's going to help a lot of people. Yeah,
Okay, well, that's good. Well, we definitely have to come back and talk about your book and talk about the different health benefits, because I know that that was one of the reasons why Edgar Cayce became so famous, is because he was helping people find cures for
yeah,
things that were otherwise deemed incurable. So that will
right.
be very interesting. We'll definitely have to come back for that one.
Sounds good.
But I'm really looking forward to your book. And for those of you and our members who want to find out more about Edgar Cayce and the continent of Atlantis, I'll leave the link below, and people can find that book on Amazon. And yeah, thank you so much, Vince, for coming again and for giving us a look into your information and again about Edgar Cayce. And we look forward to seeing you again to talk about the medical aspect of Edgar Cayce. So thank you again, everybody. Thank you for joining us, and I look forward to seeing you in the next video. Take care.